Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ARC's weekly fireside chat. This week's topic, The Work Goes National, ARC's 2021 National Advocacy Priorities. So, again, I want to welcome everyone. Since 2013, ARC has successfully advocated at the local and state level for historic changes to California's carceral system. We have passed 24 bills, several ballot measures, affecting over 100,000 Californians directly impacted by the criminal justice system. This year, we're expanding our work to engage in federal legislation and incentivize other states to align policies with national trends that reflect the brain science and current research. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Michael Mendoza. Michael, could you take a minute and introduce yourself? Michael is our Director of National Advocacy and a friend of mine and someone who I deeply admire.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you for the introduction. Michael Mendoza, Director of National Advocacy. But I've also been a member of ARC for the last 7 years. Somebody who has, experienced the criminal justice system from the juvenile to the adult prison system, and especially coming home on parole and supervision and successfully reintegrating back into society. So I think aside from the 9 to 5 that I'm a pleasure to work with you on, Sam, part of my passion and being involved in this organization is also as a member of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition.
Thank you, Michael. And so to our audience, if you're wondering why we're moving national, stop and think for a moment. Last year, we passed one of our most important bills, which is Miranda rights for juveniles. About a year or so ago, the Central Park 5 movie came out about 5 young people that were accused of crimes that they had not committed. They were interrogated and basically forced to admit to crimes that they had not committed and spent time in prison, which was traumatic in and of itself. But just imagine if that was your son or daughter that went through that. Had no rights. Basically, they didn't have a right to have an attorney call it first and be informed what their rights were. And so when we passed this last year, I think it just makes sense, both making sure that our juvenile Miranda rights are protected, but all rights of young people across the United States are protected. And I think that's hugely important. And so that's my take on it. But I'd like to, Michael, let's discuss, why is ARC working on federal legislation and expanding nationally? Why are we expanding nationally? And want to share your thoughts, and then I'll share mine.
Thank you, Sam. And you talking about Senate Bill 203, which literally protects the constitutional right of our children, is a really great example of why we're going national. And I'll explain a little bit more in terms of the bills that we've been able to pass in partnership with so many other amazing organizations. But when I think about ARC and when we were first founded in 2013 by a good and dear friend of ours, Scott Budnick, a Hollywood producer and activist, along with working alongside of others like Elizabeth Calvin, an amazing attorney who's on our board and works at the Human Rights Watch. I think when they both joined forces to really found this organization, they did it with one thing in mind. And it wasn't just to address the issues that outdated laws that have been passed in California and that deeply impacted many boys and girls, but they did it with the intention of eventually giving this organization over to the leadership of formerly incarcerated individuals. And here we are to this day after Shaka and now with your amazing leadership, being able to carry on that torch by specifically being able to share our stories, share our experiences, and more than that, but share our solutions based on our experiences. And you raised a great bill, SB 203. It actually took us a little over four years to pass that bill, starting in 2016 when Elizabeth Calvin wrote it. It's an example of the struggle that we've faced in California and other parts of the country just to pass a law. And I think what was been so helpful for us as an organization, aside from your leadership, is being able to develop a healthy process for formerly incarcerated individuals to advocate on our platform, to share their stories with elected officials, and to put a face to the narrative that we're trying to undo. One from the mid-90s where, kids as young as 13, 14, 15 years old were being called super predators. Names that would discourage any kid from even being proactive within their own communities and feel unsafe. And so I think when we look at all the bills that we've been able to pass in partnership with other amazing organizations, about 24 bills, along with SB 203, there have been some other first in the country that California has passed, like developing the youth offender parole process through SB 260. It's a bill that allowed me to prove, and up to 4,000 others, that we weren't the same kids that we were back then. And when years later, being able to expand that through the brain science and the development and the research to show that kids as young as 25 and under deserve to have their age considered when we're trying to reform policies and look at how to change the system for young people. And when you start looking at that and then see how we even ended the practice of sending kids to adult prison under the age of 16 based on the brain science and the court decisions, I think when you look at all of those things, why not? Why not go national and support other organizations and other states to fall in line with the research and the brain science, just as California has?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I want to thank you. Absolutely. You covered all of that. And I also want to welcome another guest, Marcy Mistret, Senior Fellow at the Sentencing Project. She'll be joining us right now. And Marcy, so good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Good, Sam. How are you? Hi, Michael. Nice
Great.
to see you guys. Thank you for being patient with my parenting duties.
Not a problem. Not a problem. So could you introduce yourself? How are you doing? And tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Absolutely. Well, it's nice to be back with ARC. I have known many of your members for a long time, so it's good to see everybody. I'm doing great. It's a Friday at 3:00 in DC, and as Michael referenced, we had a great hearing yesterday, so I'm feeling like I get to end the week on a high. And at the Sentencing Project, I've only been here for about 4 months. After closing the Campaign for Youth Justice, which I led for 7 years. And it was a hard decision to close the campaign, but feel very fortunate that somebody that has as big of a national footprint as the Sentencing Project was willing to take on the remaining body of work that the Campaign for Youth Justice still needed to get done in the field, in support of the field.
So thank you again, and just want to shout out Mark Maurer, Sentencing Project. I know he's retired, but one of my favorite people in the world, in the Sentencing Project that does some incredible work. Please tap in and check out the work that they're doing. Marcy, I want to ask you, what other states have passed similar laws impacted children that come in contact with the justice system?
As California, Sam?
Yes.
Okay. So, as Michael referenced earlier, there were a couple campaigns that we really focused on. And I think the pieces that really highlight that really California drafted and led the nation in is really the ending of the automatic transfer and waiver of kids to the adult system. You guys, again, as Michael said, really lead the country on that. There's nowhere else that has a hard stop for any child going into the adult system at age 16. There are a couple states like Massachusetts that have very few, it is only children, but they're as young as 14 for murder that can be transferred into the adult system automatically. So there are a couple other states that have a narrow piece. But what I will say, which I think is really exciting, is that about half of the states have changed their laws. So have either narrowed eligible offenses, which, we all hate talking about the offense driving the decision of which court to place a child, but narrowing the offense, raising that minimum age or the floor of that minimum age, or getting rid of one way of transferring children overall, like California got rid of direct file. That said, most states still have 2 or more ways to get kids into the adult system. But I will say that we are, for the first time, I think, have only 8 states that transfer more than 200 kids a year. And 200 is a big number. I recognize that, but that number used to be at least double that.
Okay. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you so much. Michael, it's well known that there are far more people in state prisons across the country than inside federal prisons. Why work on federal legislation?
That's a good question, Sam. I think one of the biggest critiques when we are talking about federal legislation, what kind of impact, if at all, would it have on states? And I think for me, what's interesting is when you look at historically what the federal government has been able to do around criminal justice, we can look at the 1996 crime bill at a time where it was a bill that was intent on providing public safety, but what it actually did was provide grant schemes that were able to incentivize many different states that Marcy can even talk about in terms of how many states back then were implementing, these tough on crime laws compared to, after these grant schemes were put into place. And so historically, we've been able to see how the federal government can incentivize states to move in certain ways through federal dollars and guidance on what can be done within the criminal justice systems, even on a state level. But I think we all know, Sam, that whether on the state level or on the federal level, with the issues that we're looking at, we should make sure that they're changed on every level, from the federal, state, and even local. So there's always room to continue to push, no matter where we are looking at in this country. But there's also some solid evidence from our historical past that show the federal government can incentivize states, provide guidance, and even a menu of options that states can choose from to align their policies to data, research, and the current science that we do have. Marcy, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of why federal legislation, because I know you've been an expert and a leader in federal legislation nationally as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think you hit on many of the major points, and this came up at the hearing yesterday, particularly around juvenile justice, which is seen very much as a local issue, and we get a lot of pushback from conservative states that the federal government shouldn't have a role, that this should be state and local decision driven. But to Michael's point, that federal crime bill, we went from having 7 states that had any sort of automatic transfer to 43. So pause on that for a second. Where the money gets driven, states will respond. USDA today still giving out billions and billions of dollars as rural improvement and development to building jails. There is a lot of money, and it's taxpayer money, and we should decide where it has to go. In terms of the juvenile justice system, we do have a federal bill called the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act that almost every state in the country participates in. And while the money isn't huge there, it does set a floor and a basis of treatment for children who come into custody at the juvenile justice system. We have only about 20 kids today that are in the federal system, but those kids are tribal kids. They don't publish race under 18. They only do it by under age 21. But we know just by looking at that data that there's probably 300, 400 people who have been sentenced to more than 20 years in the federal system. So it does matter. It does matter tremendously. And we feel like, even as a messaging point, Mr. Biden and his administration needs to right the wrong.
I totally agree with you. And I think this is a time that is ripe for us to push this legislation nationally so that it'll incentivize other states to do so. Matter of fact, Marcy, yesterday, the House Committee on Judiciary in Congress had a hearing about juvenile justice, the juvenile justice pipeline, and the road back to integration, that you played a major role in putting together. You also had some very powerful witnesses to testify. I have a question for you, but before, one of those witnesses was Brian Stevenson. Take a look at this clip right here.
Some have said that some children aren't children. Some kids look like kids, but they're not kids. Super predator myths and other distorted notions of child development have dominated our policymaking. And today is a day I hope we will recognize the era of that and change things.
So on that point, Marcy, I want to ask you, can you tell us why this hearing was so important, and if our country has recognized the harmful distortions held against children, and is our country ready for change?
Yeah. Well, and I can speak to this, Michael. You were at that first meeting from ARC that came to Washington, D.C., right? And that was 6 years ago, 7 years ago at this point. So Mr. Stevenson was there yesterday. I think it was incredibly important to have him and Marsha Levick, who was, as you know, co-counsel with him on the Miller case at the Supreme Court level. We had been trying to get a juvenile justice hearing since 2019, unsuccessfully. So the fact that the Jones decision that came down from the Supreme Court earlier this year really motivated the longtime youth justice advocates on the Hill to do something, to bring attention to this matter, and to ensure that the federal government, which still is not in compliance with Miller or Montgomery, that they do something about that. So having Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Levick there to really hold our elected leaders accountable for treating children like children, I think was really, really important.
And if I may, Sam, what I'd love to add as well, and huge congrats to Marcy and Naomi, some of our colleagues and other organizations to really put this together. It's an important question to ask. Is our country ready to recognize, this narrative that really dehumanized children? Sam, many of our members were those kids at young ages who grew up in impoverished communities. A lot of them were traumatized with lack of resources and so forth and so forth. And, when you have this narrative that really tells kids that they are not worth saving, that we can throw them in jail and basically lock the key away and even sentence them to die. I think that narrative not only hurt children, but really created a mistrust with families and law enforcement and the court system in a way that was incomprehensible to most people of immigrant families. Me being one of them, and many of our members being one of them. And now, and that was at a time where the whole entire country was in support of that message, in support of the laws that were being passed. And it was unheard of to see this kind of message that we heard yesterday on the House Judiciary Committee, where it was the opposite. It was people in leadership positions actually defending why kids are redeemable, why we do deserve a second chance, and why we should change laws. And so to have a conversation that's night and day, from the highest levels of offices to our leaders that have a huge impact in our country, I think our country is ready for that change and has demonstrated that change in various different states. And so now, especially as you mentioned, that we have a president and a vice president who are intimately aware of how these harms began in the first place and are now in positions of power to right the wrongs that many different kids throughout the whole entire country suffered. I think we are at the right time, especially when we're fighting for the truth, when we're battling over elections and results and all sorts of things. Right now is a moment where we need many different people who are harmed by the system and professionals to speak their truth and encourage more laws to be changed.
Yeah. And Sam, if I can just add one more thing to that. And Michael, I don't know if you mentioned the package of bills that came out the week before.
No, we're hoping that in the next half hour or the next 10 minutes when James comes on, we're definitely going to have some exciting news about the bill package.
Yes.
But I think to that point, Marcy, looking at the opportunities that we do have,
yeah.
And I think that's part of the question. Is this really a bipartisan issue? And I know you like to point out, Marcy, that it is, and I don't think many states or our audiences know that this is an issue that it's about children, but it is about children that grow into adults that are still caught in the system that really impacts them in so many ways. So I think I'd throw it back to you before we get to that bill package.
Yeah. I think that that's right. And I think yesterday we actually had one of the witnesses come from Utah, and they have passed a series of reforms, including ending juvenile life without parole. They've nearly eliminated transfer for children. They've gotten kids out of adult jails and prisons. They have reduced the number of beds in their state by almost 200. They have built out trauma responsive care in the community with families, culturally appropriate, and admittedly still aren't there yet. They said on the record their racial disparities continue to be egregious, but they're wrestling with it. So I think, to Michael's point, it is a bipartisan issue, and their congressman was there very much in support. I think and there was a lot of things that came up yesterday around safety of children in facilities, the rights of children to sue civilly, sue on behalf of their own civil rights. There was getting rid of fines and fees, automatic youth expungement, things that all of us know matter tremendously in the lives of young people and their families, just in order to take that next step forward. So that was really inspirational.
So I wanted to share a question in the chat by, I think it's pronounced Antoine Jordan. I wanted to know if this subject is only speaking of youth justice. And so just wanted to point out what Michael just said a moment ago, and we actually have a number of great examples. Michael's a great example of when we talk about youth justice, you're talking about a kid going into an adult system and spending all of their formative years locked in a cage. We have a gentleman here by the name of Robert Porter who works for us. Robert went in when he was 16 and he came out 41 years later. 41 years. And so when we stop and think about it, like, stop for a minute if you have children that are 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and imagine them being locked away in a cage for decades. Now let's stop and think for a minute if you have adult children. Do your adult children act the way that they acted when they were 14, 15, 16? Do they make the same choices and mistakes that they made when they were 14, 15, 16, 17? There's an entirely, I do not think the way that I thought when I was a 16-year-old. And so, Antoine, I just wanted to say, yes, this particular topic, we're focused on youth justice, but youth justice bleeds over into our adult system, because we're sending children into an adult system, and those children become adults and then come out middle-aged. I went in as a teenager and came out 42 years old. I would love for you to add to that if you want, Marcy or Michael.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is, as the members of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition are well aware, incarceration doesn't only affect that family, and it affects, doesn't only affect that child, and it affects their family and the wider community. And so, we talk a lot about the youth justice system being the pipeline straight into the adult correctional system. It does not heal children. It drives them further and further into the correctional system. And, for those of us that are abolitionists, we've got to find a different way of doing things.
Michael?
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is when you think about the whole entire prison system, especially for I'll just say this: where do the majority of the people come from? And if you weren't a child who got caught up in the criminal justice system at a young age, but maybe later on down the line, I think we all share a commonality, and that's where we grew up in. The lack of resources, the broken families, and those sorts of things that really lead to bad decision making, really lead to just a lot of different things that many people within the prison system faced at an early on age. And so I think for us as an organization that has always prioritized, these issues, especially more so even important now on the federal level when it is a bipartisan issue, when we can talk about this issue, and then hopefully the eventual outcome will be to educate on how these issues impact everyone regardless of age, but especially focusing on youth when so many people can agree on a common ground level and think about the whole entire situation from that perspective is a starting point for us.
Absolutely. And I agree. And when I look at different things too, we work a lot with young people that are incarcerated, that are currently incarcerated, and that come home. And so just from both my personal lived experience, but also working with so many young people that had ended up in the justice system and then came home and were still young, 20, 21, 22, 23, literally still making mistakes, but minor mistakes that young people make. It's just the natural thing. And someone put in the chat that people under 20, their brains don't fully develop. The brain science specifically shows that your brain does not fully develop until you're at least 25 or 26. So those impulse controls, those bad choices, that's just the natural way any human being grows up. Now, if you add with that and compound that over policing and under-resourced areas, bad schools, drugs, like all of these different things that are in the inner city, so to speak, you're setting a child up for failure, literally. And so we have to look at this as a whole picture. Like one, in many instances, over policing and actually accusing young people, again, going back to Senate Bill 203, of crimes that they did not commit and forcing them to admit things. Like these are protections that our children should just naturally have, period. It's not something that's really debatable. I'm sure if any mother or father was sitting there, they would say, I want my child protected from bad policing. I want my child protected. Children should be safe from a system that would actually prey upon them. And so that's part of the reason why we see this as both a bipartisan issue and an important issue that needs to be addressed now. Marcia, I see you. There's something that seemed like you want to add.
I was just nodding in agreement because I think your points are right on, right on the mark, Sam.
Okay, I have a question for you, Michael, real quick, because some people may know your story and some don't. How old were you when you were incarcerated, and how long did you serve? And like, could you give us like a quick 2 or 3 minute journey of your life to where you're at now?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those Mexican American kids that grew up in the mid-90s in Southern California. And a month after I turned 15, I was arrested for, jumping into a car with friends that I grew up with that lived down the street from me, because I was afraid of not being accepted and proving myself. And unfortunately, it was one of the worst decisions I made in my entire life because it ended up in gun violence that took the life of an innocent young man that I didn't even know, unfortunately. But it caused a ripple effect and damaged his family and hurt his family and the rest of society. But the response from society in California then, and this was in 1996, was me standing before a judge, being told I was going to spend practically the rest of my life in adult prison. And when I was sentenced to 15 to life for second-degree murder, that was in 1998. And on my 17th birthday, I was transferred to my first adult prison because back then they hadn't changed the laws where kids couldn't be placed in cages with adults. It was still allowed back then. And so I went into the adult system and basically grew up there for about 17 years in over 9 different prisons in California until the law had changed in 2013 when Senate Bill 260 was passed, which basically allowed me to prove that I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore. But it was a hard thing to prove and a very vigorous thing to prove in front of a board that I was interviewed for about 4 hours when the victim's family was still there and didn't want to see me come home, which I totally understood. But at that point, I had done many things in prison to change my life, including getting an AA degree, vocational trades, and really trying to set myself up for success and no longer wanting to be that kid who caused that harm to a human being, but wanting to give back. And that was only because of the hope that a law that changed had given me and so many other people. So, I mean, that's been my journey so far and why I'm so passionate today to continue to advocate in policies that will hopefully give more people hope and opportunity.
Thursday's hearing. So how does Thursday's hearing help support federal legislation and encourage Congress to help guide states in the right direction?
Michael, do you mind if I take the start of that? So I want to thank Michael for sharing his story, and I've been with him when he shared the story on Capitol Hill, as well as many other ARC members, and I want to lead with that because I have to, members of Congress they really do not know. And I think yesterday we made history. We had a young man who is doing significant time in a Washington state prison. He was 16. He is charged as an adult. He is sentenced as an adult, but he is allowed to stay in the youth facility to get rehabilitative services until he is 25 years old. And I think it was the first time in history that we had somebody actually testifying in Congress from a correctional facility. And the courage that takes is tremendous. And I wince because he was really disrespected by one member of Congress in a brutal way. But there is a huge federal role, and everyone articulated it yesterday. And they talked about this really along the continuum from prevention. And this is the thing on the juvenile justice side, they fund prevention, they fund it from a family systems approach. So it's not just funding prevention services for the individual, but their family. All the way through the court system and back home. So there's a lot of incentives in states and grant dollars to spend money away from carceral responses and back into community, getting the money directly into the hands of community and not just system stakeholders. So to Michael's earlier point, why shouldn't California lead on that? You guys have taken millions of dollars and redirected it to localities away from systems, and I think that is a something that needs to be shared as something that is not only possible but that has great outcomes.
Thank you, Marcy. Michael?
I'm sorry, Sam, I got lost in Marcy's answer. Can you answer the question?
So Thursday's how does Thursday's hearing support both Congress and federal legislation, or encourages Congress to move in the right direction?
I'm going to have to piggyback off of Marcy's comment, especially with, the amazing comments from the witnesses and really exposing the truth about how these historical harms have impacted children throughout the entire country. And to even note the international perspective that we're going to be hearing soon from our colleague James. I think just to have that conversation at that level, to continue it, to have it moving, I think goes a long ways as we just continue to push on this effort. But aside from that, I think this will hopefully be the first of congressional hearings that Marcy is going to put together, along with other amazing speakers and witnesses that will continue to have this conversation going, and maybe even have more impacted folks that can put a face to these harms that still exist within our laws in many different states and even in our federal legislature as well.
Marcy, thank you for that, Michael. Marcy, we have 3 big acts of Congress in this session. Can you share those big asks with our audience, please?
Yeah, sorry. And Sam, I should have said this when you asked me the question directly. I just got distracted by the young man that testified yesterday. First, treat children like children. So we want the federal government to set the example by getting into compliance with Miller and Montgomery. We want them to follow California's lead and end any possibility of transfer for anyone under the age of 16. We want kids to have rights around their Miranda readings and protections. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want $100 million. This was a Biden campaign promise, $100 million to close and repurpose youth prisons. The number of youth prisons in the country has dropped by about 55% in the past decade. We went from 365 down to under 150. We need to keep closing those warehouse facilities that we know don't work. And then the third ask is that we need strong leadership at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to ensure to ensure that the law that was passed in 2018 is fully implemented, because that law that passed the same time as First Step on the adult side ensures that children won't be put in isolation, that they won't have restraints placed on them and shackles, that they will get educated while incarcerated, and that promise for education returns to them home, that they won't be in adult jails, in prisons, and that they will get appropriate mental health and other treatments as part of the system. So it's very broad, and we need the leadership to ensure that it happens. It also requires states to create a plan to end the racial and ethnic disparities that exist in the system.
Marcy, thank you so much for that. We have a new guest that I want to introduce. So James, you should be popping up any minute. James Dole, how are you? Thank you for joining us. You're the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us how you're doing today, and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for having me, and I apologize for running late. I was on another panel discussion, actually, and so it's kind of one of those packed days, but it's so great to be with you, Sam and Michael and Marcy. Thank you so much for having us. Human Rights for Kids, we're an organization that is working to transform the way the U.S. criminal justice system treats children based on the fundamental principles that are found in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We also view this issue through a lens of looking at trauma that children oftentimes have experienced as a human rights abuse as well, because we know from the studies that have been done around adverse childhood experiences that oftentimes is the precursor to so many of the root problems that we see, whether it's failures in child welfare, education, or the juvenile justice system. And so we're trying to paint a more holistic picture of kids who come into conflict with the law and the need to change the system from top to bottom. And we do that work through advocacy in state legislatures and in Congress, as well as through the filing of amicus briefs in topical cases before the federal and state courts.
James, thank you for that. In April, during Second Chance Month, you led a coalition of partners in a press conference introducing a bipartisan package of bills that include one of the biggest juvenile justice bills that may have ever been introduced to Congress. Can you tell us about this bill package, please?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me start by also recognizing Marcy and Michael as our co-leaders in this effort. When we started to have these initial conversations, really, it was Michael and some of the folks at some of our other partner organizations, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth and ICANN, who are not on this discussion. We started having those conversations, and we really wanted to be intentional about making sure that this was an effort that was led by directly impacted communities, including the people who were formerly incarcerated, as well as Black and Brown communities who are disproportionately impacted by the justice system. So this is really a collaborative effort, and it's been a really incredible, effort so far in Congress. I think, the press conference was very powerful. We were glad to partner with ARC on that. And a lot of these issues actually were raised yesterday during a JJ hearing in the House Crime Subcommittee, where Brian Stevenson and others spoke passionately about why we need sort of this comprehensive reform for kids. But really, this bill package, it's 3 bills. It's a bipartisan package. The Republican is Congressman Bruce Westerman from Arkansas. The Democrats are Congresswoman Karen Bass and Congressman Tony Cardenas. And each of their bills covers a different area of the system and the way that intersects with youth. And so one way to look at it for folks that are trying to kind of wrap their minds around how this package fits together is that Congressman Tony Cardenas's bill is sort of the first of the trio, and it focuses on what happens when kids come into the system at the point of arrest. So at the very first point, when the criminal justice system is interacting with them, what happens to those kids? And so his bill will, for the first time, require that when a child is arrested, that number 1, their parent has to be notified. Number 2, that before they can waive their constitutional rights, before they can be subject to a custodial interrogation of any sort, they first have to consult with legal counsel. And that legal counsel also also has to be present in the room with them during the course of any custodial interrogation. And I could go in for all the reasons why this protection is long overdue and really needed, but anyone who's ever seen Ava DuVernay's really powerful piece, When They See Us, about the Central Park 5 case, it's a great example for why we need these sorts of protections. The second bill is Congresswoman Karen Bass's bill, and it's the second in this trilogy of bills. And it's significant because, after the point of arrest, then the question is, well, what happens to children if they're going to be charged, right? And right now in this country, at the federal level, as well as in many states, there's no minimum age for when a child can be prosecuted and adjudicated delinquent in the juvenile justice system. And so for a lot of folks out there who may be asking the question of like, how is it possible that we see these, kindergartners in these first grades, oftentimes in the state of Florida, because Florida has all sorts of issues, but but really all over, right? Why is it that we are arresting kids for essentially throwing temper tantrums? And so her bill will establish at the federal level a minimum age of at least 12, so that we are no longer arresting children under that age, and saying that in order for a child to be adjudicated in the justice system, they have to be at least developmentally essentially a middle schooler. So it's taking elementary school kids and completely removing them from the ambit of the justice system altogether, so that if there are any behavioral issues that come up with kids in elementary school, it's handled specifically in the child welfare system, so that those kids are provided treatment and services. The other really critical component of this bill is getting more kids out of the adult criminal justice system. So her bill will raise the minimum age for when a child can be prosecuted as an adult from 13, which is what it currently is when 13-year-olds are convicted of crimes involving handguns or accused of committing crimes with guns. So it'll raise it from 13 to 16. Which again is in line with best practices that are currently in place in the great state of California that ARC has already been leading on to make sure that this is in place there in the state. So we're getting a minimum age for juvenile court, increasing the minimum age for adult court, as well as eliminating the direct file ability or the direct transfer ability of the judge, so that there actually has to be a meaningful transfer hearing, where in addition to the factors that are already in the federal code, we're adding additional factors that include looking at adverse childhood experiences, early childhood trauma, as well as for the first time creating a best interest of the child standard, so that judges aren't just making determinations based on what a child is accused of when they're 16 or 17 years old, but all of the factors that led to their involvement in the system to begin with, to make the determination whether or not it's better to keep the kid in the juvenile system rather than the adult system. And then the last couple of points on her bill: it'll eliminate the felony murder rule. It'll make sure that there are no more kids placed in adult jails or adult prisons. And it will, for the first time, require data collection. It's as crazy as this might sound. We don't know how many kids or people are currently in our prison system at the federal level for crimes that they committed as children. That data is not tracked by the Bureau of Prisons. It's not tracked by the U.S. Sentencing Commission. We have a best guess that we can kind of come up with based on the number of people who were sentenced before the age of 21, but we have no idea how many kids are in our system. And so it's really important for data purposes, but also just to give us a better sense as an advocacy community who these people are, where they're at, and what the circumstances were related to their incarceration. And then lastly, her bill will create a grant block program to help incentivize states to pass similar pieces of legislation to get more kids under the age of 12, specifically out of the juvenile system and into the child welfare, having a child welfare response in place rather than a juvenile justice system response in place for those kids. And then finally, the last bill is Congressman Bruce Westerman's bill. And this is, looking at, all right, a child has been, a 16 or 17-year-old has been prosecuted as an adult, and now they're facing, very significant and serious penalties. So right now, at the federal level, kids can be sentenced to life without parole. They can be subject to the exact same mandatory minimums that adults are, even though they're children. They can get stacked sentences. So even though it's not a life without parole sentence, it's a 50, 60, 70-year sentence. So Congressman Westerman's bill will all of the kids who are prosecuted in the adult system will be 16 and 17 after Ms. Bass's bill is enacted, right? So what his bill will do, it'll eliminate life life and de facto life without parole through a sentencing review mechanism, not too dissimilar to what California initially passed back in 2012, that allows individuals to petition the original sentencing judge to have their sentence reviewed after they served a 20-year minimum. It'll also get rid of, or scale back rather, the application of mandatory minimum sentences. So it'll allow judges to deviate from mandatory minimums up to 35% away from what they would otherwise be required to impose on a similarly situated adult. And then it'll also include additional protections for child sex crime victims who commit acts of violence against their abusers, but don't qualify for the traditional self-defense statutes. And so there's another great case out from California right there with Sarah Cruz, and I'm sure a lot of folks know her case, as well as Kiana Aldridge, who was recently had her sentence reduced last fall as well. And, I think people are always like, how do, these very sympathetic cases where these girls were abused and harmed by these men, and then, they kill them or they commit a crime against them, and now they're facing these decades in prison. And so this bill will also allow judges to completely deviate from mandatory minimums or suspend any portion of a sentence that they would otherwise be required to impose. And so it's really sort of holistically looking at the system from top to bottom, point of arrest, all the way through to what happens to a child if, in fact, they are prosecuted and convicted in adult court, and what the sentencing looks like for those individuals. So in a nutshell, I know it's a lot I just threw at everybody, but that's kind of, what the bills will do in transforming the way that the system treats children.
So James, thank you for that. And to our audience, if you want to understand what systemic change is, you're looking at it. We pass these bills, we're changing the way the system has systemically, literally treated our children and as adults, prosecuted them and treated them unfairly, especially children of color. So when we talk about systemic change, this is how it gets done, and we have to get behind us and support this type of legislation. When we see it, we need to get on our phones, we need to call our representatives, we need to call our senators, and we need to tell them we want to see this passed, period. Remember your power as a voter, remember your voice as a voter, and remember that when you call, they hear, they listen. So I just want to make sure that all of our listeners are hearing this. James, I have one follow-up question. What is the international perspective on these issues in the U.S.? I want to, on a broader scale, so internationally, what is the perspective on this?
No, it's a great follow-up question. I think it's really important to understand this too, for better clarity of why we're currently in this moment as a country, and why these reforms are necessary, the necessary medicine to move us forward. And so, from an international perspective, everything that's in these bills are actually protections that are outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And if I can, I just want to take a moment. I was on my last panel I was on. I was talking about this. Our partners at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth have a really powerful report. I think that's going to be coming out next week, called "The No Child is Born Bad," and it's all about the history of the super predator theory. And, the lineage that sort of links historical racism, slavery, Jim Crow, up through the modern era. And this is really significant. And, as I was talking to folks before, you have to sort of understand this history because this is a racial justice issue. And it's impossible to separate the two, right? And the reason for that is the reason why we have so many kids who are prosecuted in the adult criminal justice system, the reason why we don't have a minimum age, why we have 10-year-olds in prison or 12-year-olds in Wisconsin who are serving decades-long sentences, right, is because of the dehumanization of mostly Black and brown youth that happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s. That was really sort of a continuation of our history of racial injustice in this country, right? And so the super predator theory propagated this notion that there were some children who were disposable, that there were these Black and brown children who were godless, jobless, and fatherless, and that unless state policy makers acted, we were going to have this, our cities were going to be overrun with crime, right? And so there was this racialized language that dehumanized Black and brown children. And that is critically important to understanding why we allowed this to happen, right? There's a really great line in a study that looks at some of these issues where it says that dehumanization is the precursor to any state-sanctioned violence. Dehumanization is the precursor to any state-sanctioned violence. So when you look historically the world over, right, whether you're talking about the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, look anywhere in the history books, and before any major act like that happens against a minority group of people, there's this sustained campaign by government actors to make those individuals seem less than. It's the dehumanization. It's calling them super predators. It's making it so that their child status is irrelevant. And when you couple that, right, with the negative portrayal of Black and brown youth in the media over and over and over and over again over a period of decades, right, that begins to desensitize the broader population that allows these broader human rights abuses to happen because they're subhuman, right, in the minds and the views of the broader population. And so in order to understand how we got here, it's really important to understand that history. And in 1994, 95, as the super predator theory is gaining this momentum and this traction, right, we see between 94 and 97 a doubling in the incarceration rate of children in adult jails. Right, we see all of these juvenile transfer laws relaxing the standards by which juveniles can be transferred into the adult criminal justice system at the same time that the 94 crime bill is going to effect, right, where there's this incentivization that is happening for states to do away with parole, adopt truth in sentencing measures, right, and children were not spared by that, right. As a matter of fact, one might argue children were the target of that because of the way that they were being perceived and portrayed in the media. And so, understanding the policies that are currently in place, you have to sort of look back in time, and that's what made it possible for these human rights abuses to happen. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the document that is supposed to protect children from this inhumane treatment, was adopted in 1989 by the United Nations. It was ironically signed by President Clinton in 1994, but was never ratified. Right? So you have this document that is created in 1989. And at the same time that happens, super predator and the relaxation of juvenile transfer laws happens that facilitates the proliferation of these human rights abuses. And so really, when we're looking sort of big picture, what we are talking about is the largest government sanctioned human rights abuse against children in the world today. Let me say that again. This is the largest government sanctioned human rights abuse against children in the world today. Right? It's not in China, it's not in Pakistan, it's not in Iran, it's right here on our shores. And it's all inextricably linked to this time period of the 80s and 90s that allowed us to jettison this idea that children are to be protected. Right? We sacrificed our children upon the altar of public safety, right? Because we said that they were super predators. And every year, 76,000 children are prosecuted in the adult criminal justice system, and 83% of them are racial minorities. That's not an accident.
Wow.
Right? And so anyways, I just want to say that to provide some broader context to why these reforms are so necessary. Everything in each one of those bills is directly found in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child or the ICCPR that's currently missing in federal law and the law of many states.
Okay, James, thank you for that. And just want to remind our audience, because that's a lot of information you've given us. This recording will live on our YouTube channel. You can always go back to get this information and listen to it again. Michael, I want to ask you, how can other organizations and people impacted by these issues help support these federal bills in Congress? Like, what can they do?
There are many. Thank you, Sam, for that question. There are many different things that impacted people and even those who support this legislation can do. And I think you've already kind of answered part of that. There are representatives in both the House and the Senate right now that need to be aware of their constituents really supporting these issues and how important they are to them. And I would also say, pretty soon, as James mentioned, we're going to be partnering with partner organizations like a Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, National Juvenile Justice Network, and so many others to figure out and find advocates within different states that have been impacted by these issues so that these legislators on both the House and the Senate within the different states can hear directly from you about why these changes are important, about why these laws are important to change to get towards better public safety, but most importantly, to protect our future generations of kids and children that are going to be our future leaders. And so I would also say that there have been many people that I'm so thankful for even being here and watching, that have mentioned themselves that, you know, their loved ones are incarcerated and were impacted by these issues at such a young age. And, you know, even your stories are very, very important and powerful to ensure that, you know, you make those calls. And then lastly, I'll say, you know, I think for at least for ARC and in our partner organizations, look on our websites, look on Human Rights for Kids, the Sentencing Project, and others, and support them in the work that they're doing. You know, one, either, you know, donations, getting involved in our advocacy. This Monday, we're going to have a policy training to dive deeper into these bills and how people can get involved. And so I just encourage everyone, you know, regardless of what your stance is or what your impact is, engage in any way you can to ensure that we protect our children moving forward.
Thank you, Michael. Last question, James, want to know, what are the next steps for making Congress support this package of bipartisan bills? Like, what are the next steps? Michael's given us action steps. Can you tell us what are the next steps to make sure that Congress supports these bills?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks again, Sam, for that. And, you know, I think at this point for us, really, it's about keeping the pressure up and keeping this issue front and center. You know, there's a lot of competing priorities right now in Congress between everything from, you know, and oftentimes, you know, we'd like to think that Congress has the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time, but I think, unfortunately, you know, what the reality has been is that it hasn't been able to. So it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that this issue is front and center, that this is an issue that doesn't go away. Marcy and others did a really great job over the past couple of weeks of getting a juvenile justice hearing scheduled in the committee that happened yesterday, actually. And so for folks that haven't watched that, I would definitely encourage going back and taking a look and hearing from, you know, incredible speakers like Brian Stevenson about why this moment is so important. But, you know, we're going to be looking at doing, you know, similar events, House briefings with staffers on the Hill, both the Senate and the House side, doing advocacy days. We're looking forward to putting an advocacy day together with ARC and the Sentencing Project and others to make sure that we get all of our young people and our constituencies at all of our organizations activated around this package of bills to make sure that, you know, everyone up on Capitol Hill, whether it's, you know, in person or virtually, knows that these are issues that are important to our community and the most important thing that this Congress can do, especially for children right now. And so in the coming weeks, you know, there'll be definitely some action alerts. And that's the other thing. There'll be action alerts that'll be going out in the next couple of weeks as well. So folks will be able to make calls, send emails, you know, tweet, really everything they can at their elected state representative or elected members of Congress to make sure that they understand this is a bill package they can get behind. And that's one thing that folks can do right now. You know, look up your member of Congress, and I will put a link in the chat box here to do a congressional lookup, and you know, reach out to them and say, hey, here are the bill numbers. This is one of the most important bill packages that's been introduced this Congress. Please sign on as a co-sponsor. Or if you happen to be a constituent of Congresswoman Bass or Congressman Cardenas, send them an email, give them a call, say, hey, thank you for leading on this. You're doing a great job. We appreciate you, right? Because we need our warriors in Congress to continue to champion these issues, to continue to fight. And then lastly, as you see things come up in the media, right, whether it's op-eds or stories that ARC and Human Rights for Kids and the Sentencing Project and our partners have been working on, lift that up, right? Get your own networks engaged, right? We've got to activate people to reach out to their members, to say, hey, this is very important to us. We need to act on it. But it's small things like that that can only take up 10, 15 minutes of your day, but can make a really huge difference. So as far as, you know, next step of this advocacy campaign, it's going to look like activating our grassroots networks, getting an advocacy day planned, doing more of these Hill briefings, continuing meeting with the White House. We had a great meeting with the White House staff earlier this week as well, where we were able to raise the connection between youth in the foster care system and youth who end up in JJ, right? So it's drawing these connections for people in power and making sure that they understand, this needs to be the #1 priority for this administration. So we're really excited to partner with ARC. Really excited to be able to work closely with Michael and Marcy. And I think we've got a really strong foundation. We're in a better position, I think, to advance, see significant advances on these issues than maybe we ever have in the past. And that's saying something, given that these bills have been introduced in the past Congresses. And so we're just proud to be here and look forward to continuing the good work together.
Thank you, James. You said that there are competing priorities, and I just want to say to our audience that we've told you what you can do. Call your representative, call your senators, tell them that you want this supported. When we think about competing priorities, when I look at my daughter who's now grown, I look at my grandchildren, there can be no greater priority than them, their protection, their safety. So when we think about competing priorities, make this a priority. I even have an idea. Everybody is having parties and get-togethers. How about people start throwing advocacy parties? In the middle of the day, everybody gets together and let's get on our phones and our emails and let's email and call people. And then afterwards, we'll celebrate the victory of being able to be advocates in a time of need. I want to ask you, Marcy, last thoughts. Could you take a minute and share last thoughts with our audience, please?
I just want to say that your voice matters to James and Michael and Sam. Your point, it's incumbent on all of us to do something. There is so much work yet to be done, and we have a rare moment right now where we can really leverage people power to take back the people's house and make sure that it's doing what it should do. So thanks for having me, and stay active.
Thank you, Marcy. Michael, take a minute. Last thoughts for our audience, please.
Yeah, I just really want to thank our audience for tuning in and their passion to uplift these issues and to learn about these issues. And I just want to thank you all for listening in and tuning in. And I think the conversation and my colleagues here, Marcy, James, and Sam, coming from different parts of the country, but getting together and having this conversation, for me, brings me hope, a hope that I hope others will continue to follow an example. And sometimes it will take hard conversations. Sometimes people won't agree, but coming together and talking about them and getting through those conversations, I think is the only hope I can continue to have and encourage others to have with everyone, and not let the little things get in the way, but prioritize what is important. And in this case, our children. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Michael. James, last thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I don't think I could say it any better than what Michael has. You can make a difference, and it's the only thing that's really going to see us through this. We've got a limited window. I think, if there's anyone needs any inspiration for, why now is the time to act, it's that, power is fleeting, and I think that's the lesson that folks should take away from the last several years that we just lived through. And, we've got a limited time where we can make this a priority and get something passed. Because if that doesn't happen, I will tell you, given the glacial pace that we saw in the last Congress around these issues, our window may close for the next decade. And that's not an exaggeration. We've got consolidated houses right now. We can get this done if we all unify and push. And so it's just so important. If there was anything you were going to do in the next year, it's right now, to really focus on this issue and try to push it through. And so just thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for your leadership and all of the leadership of the amazing people at ARC. You guys are the heart and soul of this movement. Believe me when I tell you that.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, James, for joining. And remember, everyone that's listening, you have a voice in this. Use your voice, use your vote, contact your representatives and let them know that you support this. Please do this for our children. I want to thank everyone for joining, everyone that listened today. And I want to Invite you to join us next week. We'll be highlighting the importance of mental health during incarceration and reentry in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month. Until then, everyone, take care, God bless, and see you then.